Hi, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thank you for joining us once again. I want to tell you about all 4 former Minneapolis police officers connected to George Floyd's death. They were charged on Monday. Protesters have been surrounding the White House demanding justice for George Floyd. Meanwhile, a top White House official is disagreeing with the president's approach to the demonstrations. Natalie Brand has the latest.
A now familiar rallying cry as peaceful protesters once again took to the streets in Washington, D.C.
We're standing together. We're taking care of each other. We will be here until there's justice.
On Capitol Hill, a heightened security presence stood by as demonstrators staged a momentary lie-in. Militarized police and the National Guard have poured into Washington over the past few days, and active duty troops are also on standby. President Trump defended his law and order posture in an interview with Fox News Radio.
Maybe it doesn't sound good to say it, but you have to have a dominant force. We need law and order.
CBS News has confirmed that President Trump and top aides were not happy with new comments by Defense Secretary Mark Esper. He said he would not support using the Insurrection Act to use active duty military to quell unrest.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort, and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now.
The defense secretary also took the unusual step of weighing in on the killing of George Floyd and racial injustice.
Racism is real in America, and we must all do our very best to recognize it, to confront it, and to eradicate it.
Massachusetts Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley introduced a resolution in the House to denounce police brutality, racial profiling, and excessive force.
We have the most diverse and representative Congress in the history of Congress, and we should act like it. And in this moment, Congress must function as the conscience for our nation.
It's a conversation once again elevated in the halls of Congress, as well as in homes, businesses, and streets across America.
And for the latest, Natalie Brand joins me now from the White House. Natalie, I understand that we just received an extraordinary statement from former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. Can you tell us about it?
Extraordinary, Lana. And General James Mattis, who you may remember resigned in protest to the Syria policy, has really not weighed in on policy to date, but that changed very dramatically tonight. And I'm just going to read some quotes from this extraordinary statement that reads in part, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us." He also goes on to say that we have to reject the thinking of cities as the battle space. Of course, this comes as we've seen a huge surge in National Guard troops nationwide and active duty troops who are on standby just outside of Washington, and the president threatening to send in the military to quell some of the civil unrest, which could be done in theory under the Insurrection Act. You heard the current Secretary of Defense, Esper, very adamantly say he would not be in support of that. But Mattis tonight goes on to say that at home, we should use our military only when they're requested to do so on very rare occasions. He says militarizing our response, as we've witnessed in Washington, D.C., sets up a conflict, a false conflict between the military and civilian society. So you're hearing from top military leaders denouncing the president's call to bring in military force to deal with some of these protests, which have largely remained peaceful. We've seen thousands of demonstrators peacefully marching through the streets and calling for change, calling for an end to racial injustice, an end to police brutality. We do know that there have been some violent or criminal acts late at night. And I also want to note a new DHS statement memo that was obtained by CBS News did flag that some violent opportunists, as DHS is calling them, have infiltrated some of these protests across a variety of different groups. But again, this is a small minority that law enforcement is trying to address, and the peaceful demonstrators certainly don't want them to overshadow or interfere with their much larger, powerful message. Lana?
And Natalie, I want to make sure that we understand that statement that you were telling us about. What the law enforcement officials are saying is that there is a small group that are trying to infiltrate these protests to discredit the protest. Is that what that law enforcement statement is saying?
The DHS memo that we received suggests that some extremist bad actors are infiltrating the protests that we're seeing nationwide to cause problems, that they are using these mass gatherings of people as an opportunity to incite violence and pose a threat to the public and law enforcement. And we are seeing, again, some violent behavior towards law enforcement late at night. Really, the problems really start to happen as the sun goes down and it gets late. But the DHS memo making clear that this is a group of what they're calling violent opportunists linked to various extremist groups. They didn't go into details, but that appears to be who is causing the problems and some of the violence that we're seeing in cities nationwide. That's separate, obviously, from the larger peaceful demonstrations that are happening across the country and now across the world.
And Natalie, you, in talking about former Secretary of Defense James Mattis's remarkable statement, which seems in some ways to parallel with what we're hearing from the current Secretary of Defense, Secretary Esper, both of whom were appointed by President Trump, both of them standing strongly against the president's earlier statements that he was considering using the Insurrection Act to send military personnel into states to control the protesters. Does this mean that that's off the table now for the president, or is it still possible, even though he's receiving this pushback from really celebrated defense officials, that he may still go forward?
Right.
Is that still a possibility?
The White House press secretary was asked about this afternoon during the briefing, and she said the president still has the authority to use this as a tool, but she did hint that he may be backing off while it's still on the table. She says right now they're more focused on the surge of National Guard troops onto the streets, which she noted has been effective here in D.C. And we know that that's something that can be done at the governor's request. And notably today, while Secretary Esper clearly denounced using the Insurrection Act, he did support or defend the use of National Guard troops to defend the peaceful protesters, he said, and protect the right to free speech and peaceful assembly. He said that the goal is to uphold the Constitution and protect them. And we saw on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that striking image of the National Guard troops standing guard there and the demonstrators acting very respectfully. So that's a situation where there was no sort of escalation. It was just more of a defensive posture. But National Guard troops, as we know, have been used in a variety of situations, and including to battle COVID-19. So there's more of a natural interaction between communities and the National Guard in times of crisis. The issue here that Esper was alluding to and that Mattis is alluding to is the talk of using active duty troops to potentially go in and stop the unrest or try to quell some of the violent protests. Now, we did learn from our David Martin earlier today that some troops, there was a decision made to begin potentially sending some back to their home bases, their home forts, but then that decision was delayed, according to our reporting, out of fear that things could take another turn and turn violent again. I don't know if that's based on intelligence alluded to in that DHS memo, but really these troops are on standby right now just outside of Washington, D.C., where the president could use that type of action. But we've seen widespread pushback from state governors, Democratic governors, who don't want active duty troops. And while there have been cases of the Insurrection Act being used above or in contrast with a governor's request, that is very, very rare. Actually, most recently,
very different to do it as the president certainly in opposition to the local and state leaders there. Thank you, Natalie Brand.